Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on payment fraud prevention for finance. My name is Maria. I'm the Demand Generation Manager at Brilliant. We're a leading purchase to pay automation platform. I'll be your host for today's webinar. And before we start, just a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and the recording, along with the slides, will be shared via email in the coming days. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat. We'll address them during the Q&A and at the end of the webinar. Today, I'm joined by Kevin Witkowski, an account executive at Brilliant, who helps businesses adopt automation, empowering finance teams to enhance efficiency and security. I'm also joined by industry expert Chris Wyatt. Chris is the Chief Strategy Officer at Finexio and has extensive experience in the B2B payment space. Chris has worked with major players like MasterCard and JP Morgan to drive innovation and enhance security in payments. So the agenda for today, we're going to cover the growing threat of AP fraud, the risk of manual AP processes, and how structured AP workflows, digital payments, and AI can help reduce fraud. We'll finish with a fraud loss protection strategies and a Q&A. We also have a free resource for you to download at the end of the webinar, and this will be provided to you along with the webinar recording. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chris to give us insight on fraud in 2025.
Yeah, thanks very much. And great to be with the Brilliant team. We're always excited to partner and really do these types of webinars with our partners who deal with their customers, all their customer pains. So fantastic to be with you all today. And typically the way we like to structure these is, sort of start at a macro level, right? Understanding that, potentially Brilliant customers, Finexio customers are, experiencing some type of fraud. The good news, bad news is it's not isolated to just Brilliant or Finexio. It's really, pervasive across certainly the U.S., the B2B payment space, the commercial space, and then globally, of course. And so typically where we start, look at some high level metrics, and then of course, drill into more specifics in terms of what does that mean for you? How do you deal with fraud? What are other things that you can do and or maybe haven't thought of? But we like to give some broad brush perspectives because there are a lot of great studies out there and research that comes out in addition to the stats and that we see at Finexio, and I'm sure the Brilliant team has seen. So without further ado, we'll jump in. I'm sure you've all heard of several ransom attacks that have either occurred either in the past or even very recently. I think with the advent of AI, and we'll touch a little bit more on this, it's becoming increasingly easy. We call this the democratization of sophisticated fraud capabilities, where almost anybody can replicate a voice, replicate a website, replicate a very convincing email. And unfortunately, what that means is, we have a few stats up here, but 75% increase in corporate cyber attacks worldwide. Wish that wasn't the case, but the bad guys are going to keep trying to, steal from corporates if they can. And so it's really our job to be aware and then to, see what we can do about that. Similar stat, in North America as well, doing slightly better in terms of ransomware attacks. I think we've heard about several, a couple in healthcare actually in the U.S. that were particularly troubling. And this is just something that everybody needs to be cognizant of and then able to deal with. And of course, phishing attacks. I'm sure we've all seen this, and we'll jump into this a little bit, sort of deeper as we go through this presentation. But vast increase in phishing attacks, right? That's typically driven by email, business email compromise, and it's because it's so easy to do that now. With the advent of technology, the ability to basically launch phishing attacks at scale is easier than ever, which is the bad news. It's great for marketing, not so good for if you're on the wrong end of a fraudster's email. We can jump to the next slide. So there's a couple of reports that come out every year that certainly Finexio takes a looks at, even participates in. One from AFP, which is fantastic. Just to give you again broader brush insights, we'll go through a few of the stats here. and later on in the presentation. But what they've seen is 80% of organizations have reported at least one fraud incident. So that doesn't necessarily mean each organization lost funds, had something happen, but they at least were attacked and they knew it. I think what's always interesting to think about, with these kinds of stats, while that's the majority of U.S. corporates, there's also the folks that don't know. And so typically, while we see an 80% number, we generally think it's 100%, meaning every single organization out there has attempted fraud. I mean, you and me, probably as individuals, are get fraud attempts all the time, be they come in from email, text, etc. And so that 80% number is interesting, and I think it's interesting to look at it over time, which I think we'll do. But I think more importantly, nobody's immune to this. Everybody's getting hit. Everybody's being exposed to this, and so it's really what do you do about it. I think what's more incumbent upon organizations and corporates are the cost, right? And so we have one median cost here number, $150,000 per incident. That typically is the monetary cost. So somebody stole from you somehow, right? An internal bad actor, an external bad actor, you sent funds to the wrong place. And as much as that hurts, there's also the time, reputational impact, just resource drain that may cause. And then the scrambling typically an organization is going to do to try to mitigate any further, incidents that may happen. And so that's one thing we definitely like to look at. It's burdensome to recover, right? If you can recover any funds at all, which again is very difficult typically. Certainly there could be supply chain and operational disruptions, AR, cash flow disruptions, and then certainly reputational damage. While most organizations can recover, it doesn't mean it's easy. And so a lot of what we try to do is, hey, you're not alone. This happens. But just know there are things you can do to help prevent and mitigate this. And if it does happen to you, it's not an insignificant incident typically. We can hop to the next one. So I thought what we'd do here is just focus on a few of the most common types of fraud that we see perpetrated. One, first and foremost, I'm going to start in the upper right-hand corner, is business email compromise. So this is where somebody gets a hold of your email, can mimic your email, and then can basically act as if they're you. So there's different flavors of business email compromise, but this is where somehow somebody got a hold of potentially a supplier's email saying, hey, I need the funds sent to this account instead of that account. And your team sends funds to the wrong place and then they're gone. Malware, I think we've all heard of this as well. This is stealing login credentials. Lots of different ways that this happens. There's soft ways, there's hard ways. And a lot of times, they're there to go steal data, steal funds, etc. There's various ways that this will happen as well. The ACH system itself, and we'll touch on payment methods here in a little bit, because they're not all created equal. And I think that's part of the lesson we hope to impart here is ACH checks are really the sort of the least safe, but the most common. And we'll touch on each of those and sort of why that's the case. But certainly with ACHs as an example, there's limited sort of recourse if funds are drawn from your account. If you happen to push funds to the wrong account, there's limited time window in which you can act, and if you forget to, oftentimes it's very difficult to recover anything. And then last, but not least, is the increased digital transaction volumes. They're just going up, right? So this adds complexity to any process. And so I think that's why it's really important to have a great sort of underlying AP solution, like Aurelian as an example, that can track, manage, audit everything that's happening along the way. Because without that, if you have a manual paper trail, and believe me, a lot of organizations still deal in a lot of paper, it makes it very difficult to sort of backtrack and figure out were something to happen, where did it happen, why did it happen, when did it happen. So just something to think about as we continue the conversation. We can hop to the next one. So one thing Finexio has certainly seen over the last decade that we've been in business is more and more time, effort being placed upon the shoulders of the AP team to handle, manage, look out for fraud, which isn't really what they're, you know, doing. It's not what they're good at. It's not what they were hired for, and it's very stressful. And so, one of the things we really recommend is, unless you're going to build a very robust sort of fraud management program internally, have dedicated resources to it, you likely want to look for a solution that does that for you. Just because of the level of sophistication that we touched on earlier, the bad guys, for lack of a better word, are becoming more and more sophisticated, and the ability for an AP team to just do their daily job, right, which is handle the accounts payable, make sure invoices are flowing appropriately, approval workflows are happening, and then funds are going out the door to the appropriate supplier. To think that they're going to be your front line, sort of your police force, and looking for bad guys, it's becoming less and less tenable. They may recognize something, they may see something, but I think without having really dedicated people, process, technology, that's really looking out for your best interest, and that's all they're doing. They're not worried about, hey, did this bill get paid? They're just making sure that the fraudsters can't get in the front door, and before any payment goes out, that it's getting to the right person. I think it's really important that really every organization think about that critically, and just evaluate what is the the cost benefit of sort of not doing something. So modern fraud techniques, spoofing and deepfakes, we will continue to see a lot of this. Of course, there's tons of hype about AI. We could do several podcasts just on AI and sort of its implications. But what we've seen certainly at Finexio and more broadly is you can imitate people extremely effectively and extremely easy, to the point where you wouldn't know the difference. They can call you up. They can have an email that looks almost identical. They can send emails that look almost identical coming from what looks like the appropriate domain. They can call you and it'll sound like Frank or Joe, who you potentially deal with a lot. And oftentimes they have a lot of legitimate information. They may have invoice numbers. They may have account numbers that they've been able to sort of gather through the ether. And so that's where spoofing and deepfakes really become problematic, because generally what's happening, and this goes back to what the AP teams, is they have this false sense of security. They have this trust bias. And we see this across the board. A lot of the AP teams think, hey, I know these people. I talk to them every day. They email me all the time, which is great until that person gets compromised. And then you don't recognize that, oh, something's a little bit off. That email wasn't spelled quite right, or didn't come from the exact same domain, or logo looks a little bit different. This happens all the time. And so I think one of the things to think about, and one of the things we recommend, is your AP team shouldn't, necessarily be looking out for this, because typically they are going to have this trust bias, and as they should. They're here to help commerce flow, not necessarily look for the guys that are trying to intercede and make it more difficult. Certainly, distraction from core responsibilities. I think this goes without saying. There's going to be a couple studies that come out here soon, I think, later this year, that really look at where are the AP teams spending their time. Because in the office of the CFO, CFO is hiring people on the AP side to do AP, handle the accounts payable process, not necessarily look for fraudsters. And so what they've seen is increase in fraud leads to distraction, a lot of time spent dealing, mitigating, trying to prevent fraud, along with reduced efficiency, and an increase in errors on the day-to-day job. So it's sort of a double whammy, if you will. Fraud, it's becoming harder to detect and deal with. And what that's doing is taking time and resources away from what that AP team should be doing, really their core competency, the reason you hired them in the first place. And now there's potentially some errors that are happening. Maybe invoices are being paid multiple times, not getting addressed in a timely manner. You're sort of missing terms, which cause you to get late charges, fines. We have definitely seen a pickup in this over the last year or two. And again, there's going to be some interesting studies that come out that are fairly sobering. And then last but not least on this one, right, just lack of expertise and tools. I mean, we've sort of touched on this earlier, but there's a lot of technology and know-how that's out there that typically the AP teams aren't going to be exposed to. It's not gonna, it's not gonna be covered in sort of the yearly compliance and, how do you look for fraud, where, everybody takes those tests, to basically sort of check the box that we did something. It's really, a level of sophistication that is probably an order of magnitude or two higher than what, the average person has. And so again, it's not what they're hired for, which again is why we think being very diligent in how you look and address these issues is really incumbent. We can jump to the next one. So for those of you playing at home, we always like to get a sense, because now what we want to do is jump into payment methodology. How are some of those bills being paid? Oh, doesn't look like anybody. Well, we'll see if anybody votes here. All right, we've got one so far. 2, 3. We'll give it another second here. And so the idea here, and we'll touch on, are checks feel very antiquated. I mean, I think certainly in a retail sort of individual mindset, if you think about, how many of your bills are you still paying, with a check personally? Typically, it's not that many. I don't have a checkbook anymore. I think I could get a check from my bank if I needed to, but it's typically not something you do, as an individual. Most everything's paid online with a credit card, potentially, get points, etc. Because what we'll see here, we'll give it just another second here. There we go. All right. Looks like we have ended the poll. So good news is, there we go. Looks like 60% of you were doing 25% checks or less, but that still leaves 40% of you, sort of doing somewhere between 26 and 75%, which isn't uncommon. For any of the companies, and we work with hundreds and thousands of different companies, sort of depending on how you count, some are all still using paper to a degree, right? To the tune of checks. We see some companies using 100% checks, which is very sort of disheartening. But it wouldn't be uncommon for an organization to still be, making half of the payments, their AP payments, via a check, whether it's them writing it out or they send it to their bank, and the bank, are printing out checks. It's still very pervasive. And so I'd say, we don't have a lot of responses here, but definitely skewing more towards the lower end, which is fantastic. And we'll jump into why here in a second. So we can jump to the next one. So here we are. So again, this comes from the AFP report that I mentioned. There's a little citation at the bottom if you guys want to look for it. Otherwise, it's easy to Google or ask ChatGPT to find it for you. But these are the typical payment methods that we see in the AP space. Checks, of course, ACH. These can be debits. These can be credits, depending on how things are set up. Wire transfers, and then virtual cards. We'll touch on all these briefly. But I think the main point here is, if you think about from a quantity standpoint, where are sort of all the fraudsters attempting fraud? It's with checks. In fact, the majority are still on checks, which is sort of crazy to think about, but it's also the easiest. You can steal checks out of the mail, which happens every single day. There's a lot of horror stories. In fact, USPS late last year actually recommended that you don't send checks in the mail. Ideally, even if it's like grandma, sending, the grandkids a check, like they're really discouraging it, because unfortunately this happens a lot. And we wish we could say it's getting better. It's actually got a little bit worse from year to year, from 2022 to 2023. And that's not uncommon. And then second, and I think this is important to point out, and it's not really highlighted in these stats, is around ACH. ACH feels safe. It feels, a bit more modern and pretty common. And it certainly is for a lot of those larger transactions. But what we see is a significant amount of fraud with ACH. And that's typically where the dollar sits. So if the most common fraud vector from a pure quantity standpoint is on checks, the dollar impact is actually most felt on ACH fraud. We certainly see it on wire transfers, but wire transfers have really sort of decreased over the years. They sort of use it for very special circumstances now. And then the one that's we've been seeing grow significantly in terms of volume with little fraud are virtual cards, and we'll touch on why virtual cards are a great solution. But it's many of the reasons why you have a credit card in your wallet in the first place, right? If there's a charge that's not yours, you're not going to be responsible for it. Assuming you report it and take care of it. So there's a lot of benefits to working with a trusted network. Think Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover. Those are the networks, and they're there to protect you. And so a lot of times, while the fees are sort of highlighted in the news that they're expensive and everything, that also comes with some guarantees, not only for you, potentially as a customer, buying whatever it is from your vendor or suppliers, but also for the vendors and suppliers as well, so that they have guaranteed payment. And what you can see is the fraud rates are extremely low in the card space. This goes for other types of cards as well. But virtual cards can be a very interesting solution to help mitigate a lot of that potential fraud really across the board. We can hop to the next one. So, so just back to checks, briefly, because most of the organizations that we work with are still using checks. And these are really the reasons why it's still so prevalent. So you can counterfeit a check. The thing that still blows my mind is the account and routing number is on the bottom of every single check, which, with that information, you can go basically create your own check. Not to say that it's always going to work. Often there are controls in place, so it's not, free game for everybody. But again, the bad guys are very good at figuring out how to try to perpetrate fraud by counterfeiting checks. Forged check signatures, this does happen if something gets stolen out of the mail, or this is saying, hey, I'm writing you a check, and I'm the CFO of the company, right? So that can happen where they're actually, creating a counterfeit check, fraudulently signing it as if they are the CFO or the CEO or whoever's responsible for, basically signing over a check to, a given vendor or supplier. And then certainly the forged endorsement. So this is, you get a check, it's not yours, you sign it, you try to go cash it. It still works. It doesn't work in a whole lot of cases, but it's still very prevalent where a bad guy will try to take that check and go cash it someplace, wish it didn't happen, but it certainly does. Remotely created forged checks. So again, I think you've also seen the technology that's out there. A lot of times you'll just take a picture of the check that you receive, in the mail, versus actually physically going to a bank. This is what this is. So a lot of times you can remotely create forged checks. You can actually submit those, through the Fed, and or through your bank, and you could potentially, be exposed to fraud that way. And last but not least, duplicate presentment. So trying to, cash a check multiple times, through different banks or different means, taking it to a Western Union. These are all, methods that are still out there. Again, I go back to that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, Catch Me If You Can. Some of the same techniques that he was employing so in that movie, which is back, I think, in the 50s or 60s, are still used today. We haven't really solved all of them. So just bear that in mind. And then, next time your organization is writing a check, like, is this the best thing you can do? Is there another way you could potentially be making this payment? And again, look, this isn't to say like the majority of checks that are written are stolen and fraud's perpetrated. But again, if it happens once, twice, three times, for most organizations, that's more than enough. They prefer not to ever have it happen. So again, just food for thought as we sort of continue through this conversation. All right. So we touched on this briefly, so we won't go too deep. But what we did want to focus on here is, like, we're in this new digital age, and we talk about a few of the ways that fraudsters like to compromise businesses, be it via email, spoofing, etc. But there are some things that you can do. So there are some manual processes that if you don't have in place, you likely definitely should. But then there's also technology that can help with some of this. So things that we see, certainly at Finexio, dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars in payments and working with AP teams all the time, is they're going to physically call the supplier to make sure, hey, is this really legit, etc. And that's a great way. Ideally, you're calling a number not that a bad guy gave you, but that you actually know is legitimate. The only problem with that is it's extremely time consuming. To have to run through that process, it's not efficient. Manually looking at all your invoices, again, very time consuming, but is a bit safer. So again, it's a matter of these trade-offs of how much time are we willing to commit your AP team to sort of doing these manual checks versus everything else that they need to do within a given day. And then some of the tools that are out there today, just so we're clear, that oftentimes banks will sell you, or you'll think you're safe. A lot of times, they'll give you that false sense of security. So there's things called positive pay, right? Which is a file you submit to your bank. Here are all the checks I'm writing today. Here's the amount. A lot of those are still subject to manipulation. A lot of times the fraudsters know that, that positive pay file exists, and there are ways that they can circumvent that or submit their payment, check a payment into the check stream first before it actually even gets to the supplier. So there's different ways that, and again, these can be internal bad actors. What I don't want to sort of lead you guys down the path of is thinking this is all just external guys, in India, Africa, etc. You need to be looking internally as well in terms of where fraud can happen. And then, of course, there's blocks, filters that you can have on your emails, your network, VPNs, etc. Again, a lot of those can be spoofed and/or just circumvented altogether. So, not to say that these are bad things to have in place, but just again, don't have that false sense of security that these are going to solve all sort of all the woes out there and keep you fully protected. Because what we know is it's just not the case, and it's not just you. If you're a small business, medium-sized business, guys like Google, Facebook have all been affected by this to the tunes of many tens of millions of dollars. So again, this isn't isolated to smaller companies with limited technology. The largest companies in the world with the best technology are also affected by this. So again, it's to say like nobody's going to be perfect. It's just don't be complacent and assume that the tools you have in place are exactly what you need. We can jump to the next one now. So I think from here, I'm going to turn it over and let the Rillian team talk about some best practices, as it relates to what they do. And then I think we'll hop back on in the end and talk a little bit about what else you can do to help protect your payments. But take it away, Maria and Kevin.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. It's super insightful details on the rise and the type of payment fraud that we're seeing. And as Chris mentioned, relying on your AP team to catch fraud isn't enough. We really need a strong end-to-end automation platform, and that's the key to mitigating risk. Kevin has helped companies implement true AP automation technology that automates everything from the invoice capture all the way to the payment reconciliation in a secure and efficient way. And he's going to walk us through effective strategies to reduce fraud from the start. So, Kevin, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Maria. I really wanted to just touch on a few small points and how the Rillian solution is able to kind of mitigate some of these risks that you're seeing within your process. So really at Rillian, we're trying to give you the tools and the structure in your AP process to really kind of close some of these gaps. The first way that we do that is by ensuring that your approvals are all done by the correct people in your organization, and that we're getting away from a lot of those manual processes that you guys, that we've seen out there, that there's still a lot of companies that are using. I was just meeting with a company today, and we were going over how they were doing all their approvals over email. It's a long thread. One person puts approved, they pass it on to the next person. There's really not a ton of visibility for the company as a whole into how that process is going, if there's any slowdowns in the process. The idea with what we're able to do here at Rillian is within our platform, we can have those approvals all done and tracked. You can approve them directly in our system. We can send a secure email to you guys where the approval is actually logging in and approving that way, and it also can be done on mobile, but everything is tracked in Rillian. The idea is that there is proper visibility into who's doing those approvals and kind of what rules in which you have set in place to ensure that the right people are seeing the right invoices and that the proper thresholds are being calculated. One thing that we're able to do within the Rillian platform is we're able to put like dollar amount thresholds where if a transaction comes in and say it's over $20,000, I mean, that may be something that would require C-level approval. So once the person who's originally made the request has approved it, it goes through several different layers so that we do get the proper visibility into any of these big expenditures, and that we have those extra layers in place to help you guys safeguard and to make sure that some of these transactions that are more susceptible are not getting made. One of the other things that we really help with is a lot of companies are all over the world where their spread is. They have multiple locations. Sometimes having the visibility when you are in multiple countries, you have multiple locations. Are the right people getting the approval? Are the right people seeing these? So we can give you all that in a centralized platform where you're able to see exactly who approved what, when, and all the right people are getting involved in the process. We're also really big on segregation of duty. So there's an example of a professional football team where they recently had an employee basically steal from them $22 million. And part of the reason why that happened was the same person who was making the requests was also the same person that was paying. So we want to ensure that there are multiple people that are involved in the process, that the same person isn't the one who is making the request, who's approving the request, and then paying the request. The idea is that the organization and the right people that should be involved are going to be, so that we can prevent against things like that happening. Much like the person who's making the request, I mean, sometimes they're not the ones who are actually receiving the goods. I mean, fraud can potentially happen even internally with your company, where someone could potentially submit an invoice, mark it as paid, and they could even be the one that's paying themselves with it. So the idea is that the people who are doing the approvals and making the request are obviously not the only person that needs to be involved in ensuring that gets paid. One of the best parts I would say about the Rillian platform really is the audit trail. So we do provide you with a comprehensive audit trail. We can see not only who's doing the approvals, but also who's making any kind of changes to the invoices, if the dollar amounts change, if the accounts coding changed, any key piece of information, we keep track of all that. So at the end of the day, you have a complete ability to view within your organization exactly what kind of changes are being made and who made them and what they did. So if there are any kind of issues or anything, the idea is that hopefully you can catch them pretty quickly. Maria, if you could move to the next one. All right. So obviously we want to ensure that, not only are we setting the safeguards in place through our process improvements, but we're also giving proper visibility. So we do have real-time reporting that allows you to really understand what your company is spending. How much did you pay an individual vendor? How much did you pay all your vendors? We basically allow, through our analytics platform, we have 17 different dashboards that are actually meant for different people within the organization who have different roles and responsibilities to really understand what's going on in their department and to really understand, in an intelligent way, if there's anything that potentially could indicate that something may not be right or something, doesn't look correctly, or this vendor seems to be getting a lot of different, payments at a frequency that seems more than what was originally kind of planned upon. So really, the analytics provides a great, intelligent way for you to kind of really understand how your business is at any given time. You also have the ability to kind of look back, see how you're doing in previous years, see how much you paid a vendor in previous years. Is it matching to kind of what you are today? So if there are anything, the idea is that this real-time visibility into your business as a whole will give you some of those insights to potentially end these ability for fraudsters to kind of jump in and to see any kind of misuse or any kind of issues that may arise in your system. So with our platform, we obviously offer the portion for the AP automation, But we partner with Finexio, and we use a lot of the tools and safeguards that they have in place to ensure that your payments are actually, going to be secure, that they're going to the right places, and we take a lot of that stress off of the AP team with our unified solution. So, Chris, want to tell us a little bit more about, kind of what that would look like and how Finexio fits in with that?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That was great. And we love working with Rillian and the Rillian team. I think a lot of what they've done is fantastic and really, industry leading. So excited to see some of the capabilities that they have, and I know there's always more to come. So that was fantastic. Appreciate it. So we'll touch on a few slides, and again, if you haven't sort of thought about payments, we'll give you a crash course here, and then of course the Rillian team can certainly go into more details. But the way we like to think about payments is really under sort of three primary principles. One is optimize, and so this is optimizing the ideal payment mix. So ideally, getting more and more of those vendors and suppliers off of checks to something digital, something traceable, something that's safer. And then from there, looking at are there ways to actually monetize those payments. And so this is where something like a virtual card comes in, where what you'll find is anywhere from 20 to 30%, and again, every industry is different. But let's take 20% as a number of your vendors and suppliers will happily take a card. Just like you pay with your card on Amazon, a lot of vendors and suppliers are happy to take a card from you, and they like it because it's speedier payment, it's a guaranteed payment. A lot of times that transaction is actually directly tied into their accounting software, so they know that they've been paid, they can check the books. And so while yes, there are typically fees associated with that, just like there are, if you accept credit cards and you've got your own business, oftentimes it's seen as being worth it. But what that does is generate, a little bit of sort of net new revenue, which then can help go, to offset your costs with Rillian, depending on what sort of construct you work. But just think cash back, or very similar to if you get points back, if you have a points card, same concept, just on a business scale. Right. And the good news is you don't have to worry about how all that happens. The Rillian and Finexio teams make sure that, it all happens for you. And then third and last but not least is doing it securely. And so we'll touch a little bit more on security here in a minute, but really the most important thing is, securing as many of those payments as possible. I wish I could tell you we could secure checks. There are some things you can do and work with your bank, but we do have capabilities around ACH payments and virtual card payments that effectively eliminate you from that sort of fraud exposure, and we'll touch on that. So the way we really think about it is, look, transition to digital. It just needs to happen. You're already doing it in your personal, sort of in daily life. There's no reason businesses need to stay in the past, sending a bunch of checks. Payment flexibility. A lot of times when we see our AP teams, may send checks, may log into a bank to send a wire or an ACH. It tends to be a very disjointed process, and while there's optionality, doesn't mean it's flexible, right? And so what we were able to achieve with Rillian is a streamlined workflow, similar to what you do with all your invoices, how they can help sort of really streamline that process and make it simple. Same thing with payments. What if all of a sudden now you don't have to worry about how the payments are made? You just need to be able to tell them, hey, I want to make this payment to this person for this much, and then we take it from there, right? So you can get out of the decisioning process of how to actually facilitate that payment. You don't have to make it. It can be made on your behalf. Again, with those three tenets in mind: optimizing them, making them as digital as possible, monetizing those payments if possible, where suppliers and vendors are happy to take a card as an example, and then doing it all very securely. And then, of course, like Kevin mentioned, enhanced visibility, real-time tracking, knowing exactly where your payments are at any given time. And when typically what that is also going to mean is cost reduction. So that's can be material cost. You're literally not putting stamps on envelopes, but your team's also saving time. They're able to go focus on what they do, do better. And then the other thing, sort of associated with that is typically there's a lot less sort of angst from suppliers. Hey, where's my check? The dog ate my check. Can you send me a new one? Typically what you're going to see is sort of improved supplier relationships, because you're paying them in a more efficient manner, which also reduce costs. So I think there's a lot of benefits to transitioning to digital. And we'll touch on a couple more here on the next slide. So I think we touched on virtual cards a little bit earlier. Just want to make sure like this, ideally really hits home for you if you're not familiar with them, because what we've seen, the industry's seen, and again, Finexio, works very closely with guys like JP Morgan, MasterCard, Visa, Discover, Amex. And what we've seen is one, virtual cards can be issued quicker, they can settle faster. So speed of payment is of interest. It's one of the fastest ways to make a very secure payment. Certainly as opposed to a check, which if you think about the check process, there's all right, I need to send a check, I need to get it to the printer or print it myself, put it in the mail, hope that it gets there. And then even once it gets there, that company then needs to do something with that check. Either deposit it remotely, take it to the bank, and then wait for that check to settle, which can take many times days and potentially weeks, depending on sort of what their cycle is to deal with those, which again then can really impact cash flow. So I just take the time example we just walked through. That alone improves cash flow, eliminates late payments, ideally overpayments. A lot of reconciliation issues become significantly easier because now you're digitally tracking all this. I think we touched on lost checks. Things are going to get lost in the mail because there is no mail. That's really the idea, is delivering these virtual cards, and they're virtual for a reason. You can deliver them via email. We also have the ability to actually make payments via a virtual card on a vendor portal. So I think if you have to log into a portal to make a payment, that service is certainly available as well. Reduce risk, we talked about that. There's expiration dates certainly on every single card. They're fixed dollar amount, and there are a lot of eyes looking at it. So it's not just the likes of Aurelian and Finexio that are looking for bad guys, but it's the card networks themselves. Again, think Visa, MasterCard. It's the banks themselves. If it's JP Morgan or whoever you bank with. So there's a lot of additional focus on anything that's a card transaction, which for you as AP team, CFO, should give you a lot of reassurance. There's just more eyeballs trying to prevent that fraud, because oftentimes now with a card, they're on the hook. Maybe you're not on the hook, but the issuing bank, et cetera, are on the hook. So they want to eliminate as much fraud as possible. Which is why you see so many robust measures. Personally, if you've ever had your card stolen, right, there are dedicated fraud teams. More than likely, unless you're a very big organization, you probably don't have a dedicated fraud team, or if you do, it's pretty small. And which is why we really think the actual payment capabilities is something you might want to look to outsource, at least to a degree. And then certainly revenue share. So I think we touched on this, cash back. So every virtual card that's accepted generates cash. It generates interchange, which is, some of that can then be shared back with you. And many times that can be extremely significant, depending on virtual card adoption. And oftentimes, it will offset all the costs that you've ever experienced in terms of facilitating payments. So again, that's just an exercise. You can work through with the Aurelian team as an example, and see what this potentially could mean for you. But almost without fail, at Finexio, where we work with hundreds and thousands of companies, most of the time they stop paying for sort of those hard AP costs associated with payments, because they're able to offset those costs with revenue share. We can jump to the next one. So, a few things to think about. We wanted to, not quite leave with this, but I think there's one slide after this in terms of how do you lower your risk of payment fraud, right? So I think we've touched on a few of the issues associated with, payment fraud within AP, sort of the degree of the issue, depending on the payment method that's being chosen, a couple of solutions there, but then what do you do internally, right? And what do we do, for you as a Aurelian and Finexio team? So I think real-time fraud detection and prevention. So again, likely not something you have in place today, but they're dedicated teams that all they're doing is looking for potential fraudsters, and they've seen, a lot more attempts, likely than you have as an organization, simply because of the volume that a company like a Finexio is dealing with. We see things across the board, and we also have very close relationships with, JP Morgan, biggest bank in America, the card networks, who are also like, hey, this is what we're seeing. So a lot of, a lot tighter, closer collaboration, which is all great news for you. It means, you can spend less time worrying about, hey, is my payment going to the right place, and more, spend more time on your business. Other things, comprehensive vendor validation. We touched on this a little bit, but this is, making sure you know who you're talking to, making sure you're not being spoofed, making sure that email is from the right place, making sure if this vendor wants to make a change to their bank account information, that's valid and appropriate, and that bank account is actually associated with, the company you're trying to pay. All things you could potentially build yourself, but there's no need to. It's very expensive, very time consuming, and then typically you're going to need a dedicated team to just do that. And so depending on the level of validation that you have, I think the only thing you might be doing well is if you're picking up the phone and actually calling the vendor and talking to them and confirming things. But as we mentioned before, it's very time consuming and probably not the best use of time for, ultimately for your team. Compliance reporting. So that's the other thing, when you get into this, is there's a lot of, just compliance that, comes along with facilitating funds movement, making sure you're not paying fraudsters, money launderers, terrorists, etc. The good news is you get enhanced compliance monitoring because certainly Aurelian, Finexio, all the banking partners that we work with, we have no interest in paying bad guys. And so you get, again, that extra set of eyes, making sure funds are going to the right place. Even if your team does get spoofed and you say, hey, we need to send $1 million over here, we're going to look at it too, make sure like we don't see anything that's nefarious, again, more with our expert eyes. So again, just another layer of security that you can benefit from. And then risk management. So while we all know everybody's, most companies have some type of risk management program in place, anything from educational videos and processes. Again, you get another layer of that and dedicated teams that all they're doing is looking to mitigate risk, specifically around your payments without you having to worry about it. And so all, so the culmination of that, is really this sort of concept of built-in fraud protection, that you get, extremely cheaply, frankly. And again, I think it's just more peace of mind as well that you're able to benefit from. Let's hop to the next one. So, and I think this is where we wrap, but what we're proud to be able to announce is something called Shield. And the idea here is we've got, certainly, in working with Aurelian and Finexio, working with lots of different partners, we've been able to actually develop a product called Finexio Shield, which is effectively a fraud guarantee. And while we can't offer this on checks, I just want to be clear, checks are, again, very antiquated. It's very difficult to, prevent check fraud systemically. What we are able to do is effectively guarantee the ACH and the virtual card payments. And so what that means is any payments that you are facilitating through Aurelian, and where Finexio is helping to, get those payments to the right place, you have guaranteed coverage, typically up to $1 million per fraud loss. So again, this is just the idea of, hey, there's a lot of people, process, technology you could put in place. We have it in place. And in fact, we've gotten insured by some of the largest insurance companies in the world. You can think Lloyd's of London, AIG, Chubb, et cetera, which then enable us to be able to offer you this solution where for any of those electronic payments that we're able to make for you, you are literally risk-free. We're willing to take that risk on because we're very confident in our processes. And if something were to happen, it's on us, it's not on you. So certainly something for you all to think about as you sort of venture forth. Because again, I think Aurelian and Finexio want you all to be as safe as possible. We want to make it as easy as possible. So I think a lot of this is can sort of slow down, the wheels of business, and that's the last thing that we want. So if we can make things a little bit simpler for you on the payment side, eliminate fraud, that's what we're here to do. So Maria, I think I'll give it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Chris and Kevin, for this insightful details on how fraud can be really mitigated from the start during the AP process, and how digital payments are key for safer, efficient, and cost-effective payments. We have 10 minutes left, but we do have a couple of questions, so I'll get started with them. If you have any other questions, feel free to keep dropping them in the chat. So the first question is for Chris. Does Finexio Shield cover fraud loss on payments by paper check?
No, is the short answer. I wish we could, but I think, as we touched on earlier, very difficult to do that simply because there's too many hands sort of touching them. They're physical, they're physical. You can steal them out of the mail. The mailman can just lose them, and then somebody gets it. There's any number of reasons why it's very difficult for anybody to offer a guarantee on checks. So bad news is there. The good news is, in working with Brilliant, we're able to convert a lot of those payments to electronic, which then would be included in the Shield program.
Got it. So paper checks are part of the past. So Kevin, I got a question for you. You talked about the audit trails to see who made changes to invoices in the system. How long is that information available? How long is that information stored in the system?
Okay, yeah, great question. So we do have the ability to store that indefinitely. And there really isn't a cap. However, in the US, legally, we are only able to store that data for up to 7 years. So hopefully, if there's anything that you need to uncover or review, you'd be able to, discover that within 7 years.
Okay, that's a nice safeguard for the whole business company. Okay, and then another question is, what if our suppliers are unwilling to move to virtual cards? This is for Chris.
Yeah, the good news is we don't force anybody to take a particular payment method. I think the best way to think about it is sort of a gentle direction. So what you'll often find is there's maybe some initial hesitation, but for those folks that are, sort of willing and able, it's not that tough. Again, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of times they see the value and benefit of that. Again, back to the Amazon analogy. Amazon's not going to send you a bill and then say, hey, send me a check, right? You use a card, right? So again, a lot of businesses are of a like mindset to say, hey, this is just easier for me to accept payments. I may understand there's, a fee, but it's worth it to me, for various reasons. If it's speed, security, trust, ease of access for, more businesses to do business with them, any number of reasons for that. But look, if that doesn't work, there's always other options, electronic options, as we touched on, like an ACH type product. So there's no requirement per se. We just try to convert as many folks as we can that are willing and able.
Got it. Okay. Well, those are all the questions that we got for today. So just before we wrap up, we did mention having this resource available to you. It's our AP Fraud Prevention Playbook. You can download it using the QR code. So we'll also send this with a recording in an email in the next couple of days. And then as well, if you are interested in a more in-depth discussion on how Brilliant can help you optimize any of these financial processes, you can visit our website or use the QR code to schedule a customized demo directly with Kevin. So if you guys don't have any other questions, let me check the chat. We do not. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. We appreciate you and your time. Thank you and have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.